The cane came down wrong on the jet bridge, and that single misstep, a half-inch of rubber tread catching on a worn sole, was the only warning anyone got that the morning was about to break apart. Delta Flight 2214 sat at Gate B12 in pre-dawn Atlanta, its fuselage still beaded with condensation from the overnight dew, windows glowing amber under the apron lights while ground crew moved beneath it like men tending something sleeping. The boarding call had gone out 20 minutes earlier, 6:40. A sky the color of a healing bruise, the kind of cold that lives only in the hour before a Georgia summer remembers itself. Inside, the cabin smelled of drip coffee and the particular plastic and carpet scent of an aircraft that had been cleaned too quickly between flights. In Seat 2C, first class, sat a man named Daniel Okaforez, 61 years old, dressed in a charcoal wool coat he hadn't bothered to remove yet. His reading glasses pushed up into close-cropped gray hair that had gone the color of iron at the temples a decade early. He had the build of a man who had once run marathons and now mostly walked, broad through the shoulders, a slight stoop forward from years bent over briefs and binders, hands large and knuckled, the left one bearing a wedding ring worn thin from 40 years of turning. He carried a brown leather satchel that he set beneath the seat in front of him with both hands, gently, the way a person sets down something they have buried people for. He was traveling to Washington for a closed-door session that began Tuesday morning, though nothing about his demeanor suggested urgency. He had learned long ago that real authority never announces itself by hurrying. He'd flown into Atlanta the night before to see his daughter graduate from her residency, and the ceremony was still sitting warm in his chest, her white coat, her hand shaking his, the photograph he kept glancing at on his phone screen before locking it again. He was tired in the specific way of a man who has cried twice in 12 hours and is still deciding whether to be embarrassed about it. He ordered black coffee from a flight attendant named Priya, whose laminate name tag caught the cabin light, and thanked her by name when she returned with it, which made her pause for half a second longer than the transaction required, the way people do when they are unexpectedly seen. 2 rows back, in 4A, sat Marcus Webb, a software salesman from Charlotte who'd already put his AirPods in before the door closed. Across the aisle, a woman named Renata Castillo rocked a sleeping 18-month-old against her shoulder, murmuring apologies to no one in particular for sounds the baby hadn't yet made. The cabin filled the way cabins do. Overhead bins clapping shut, the safety card flipped through and ignored, a toddler somewhere in coach already crying with the pure committed grief of a child who does not want to be on an airplane. It was at the door, just before the flight attendants began their final sweep, that the disturbance started. Not loud, not yet, just a voice rising half a register above the murmur of the cabin, sharp enough that 3 or 4 heads turned toward the front before turning away again, assuming it would resolve itself. Daniel didn't turn, but something in his posture changed, a stillness settling over him the way it does over men who have spent careers learning to listen without appearing to. She came down the aisle like a verdict already rendered. Karen Voss Whitfield was 48 years old, dressed in cream-colored cashmere that had clearly never touched an actual sheep pasture. Sunglasses pushed up into a blowout so structurally perfect it seemed engineered rather than styled. A quilted leather tote slung over one shoulder with a logo the size of a demand letter. Her rolling bag, the kind airlines measure and reject at the gate, clipped 2 armrests on its way back to row 6. And she didn't apologize to either owner, only sighed the specific sigh of a woman who believes other people's elbows are an imposition on her itinerary. "This can't be my seat," she announced to no one and everyone, stopping dead in the aisle so that the line behind her concertinaed into stillness. "I booked Comfort Plus. I am not sitting in a middle seat like—" She gestured vaguely at the cabin, as though gesturing at livestock. The flight attendant, Priya, came back down the aisle with the practiced patience of someone who had already had this exact conversation 4 times that week, and explained, gently, that the seat matched her boarding pass exactly. Karen's mouth tightened into something that wanted to be a smile and wasn't. "Do you know who I have lunch with on Thursdays?" she said, not waiting for an answer. "I am personally acquainted with someone on this airline's board. I will be having a conversation about how passengers are treated on this carrier." She said carrier the way some people say establishment, a word borrowed from a register she didn't quite belong to but liked the sound of. She did not move to her seat. Instead her gaze swept the cabin, restless, looking for somewhere better, someone smaller, some terrain on which she could win something. It landed, eventually, 3 rows up, not on Daniel, not yet, but on the woman boarding directly behind him. Sister Agnes Marin was 73 years old and had flown perhaps 11 times in her life, every one of them in service of something larger than the flight itself. A mission clinic in Lagos, a sister parish in Manila, this time a hospice program in Bethesda. She had spent 6 years fundraising for one folding table at a time. She wore the gray habit of her order, simple, unornamented. A small wooden crucifix at her collarbone worn smooth by decades of thumb. She moved slowly, leaning on a cane with a rubber foot gone bald from use, and she had stopped at the top of the Jet Bridge stairs, Atlanta's older gate, the kind that still occasionally used mobile stairs instead of a bridge when the gate was reassigned, to steady herself before the final step down into the aircraft. It was that pause, that half-second of an old woman gathering her balance, that put her directly in Karen's path. "Oh my God," Karen said. Not under her breath, not remotely under her breath. The words landing with the particular cruelty of someone who has decided an obstacle does not deserve courtesy. "Some of us have somewhere to be." And she said it while already moving, her shoulder catching the strap of the nun's bag, her rolling case nudging forward into the back of failing knees that had no warning and no time to brace. Sister Agnes went down the last 2 steps wrong. Not far, not dramatically, the kind of fall that looks small on a security camera and feels like the entire sky coming down to a person of 73. Her hip catching the steel handrail, her cane skittering away across the tarmac, a small, sharp cry escaping her that silenced the jet bridge more completely than any shout could have. Daniel was on his feet before the cabin crew reached the door. He had not seen the shove. He was 3 rows inside the aircraft, his back to the open door, but he heard the cry, and something in him that had been trained across 4 decades of courtrooms and 2 of a particular kind of quiet public service moved before his thoughts caught up to his body. He was at the doorway in seconds, kneeling on the jet bridge beside a woman in gray, his wool coat dragging against the steel grating, his hand finding her wrist with the steady, practiced gentleness of someone checking for a pulse he didn't actually doubt was there but needed, in that moment, the ritual of confirming. "I'm here," he said. "Don't move yet. Just breathe. Tell me where it hurts." Sister Agnes's eyes were wet, more from shock than pain, her hand gripping his forearm with surprising strength. "My hip," she said. "And my pride, I think, mostly my pride." A small, brave attempt at a laugh that cracked halfway through. Above them, Karen had not stopped walking. She had reached the cabin door and was now addressing the gate agent who'd hurried up the stairs behind her, her voice pitched for an audience. She was blocking the stairwell. "I have a connection in Reagan. I cannot be held responsible for someone who can't keep up the pace of boarding." She said it the way a person recites a fact they have already decided is unimpeachable. Then, looking down at the small gathered crowd around the fallen woman, at the gray habit, at the small wooden cross now resting crooked against her collarbone, Karen's mouth curled into something almost like satisfaction. Maybe she should have thought about that before she decided to dress like it's the 1800s and block a federal walkway. The words landed across the jet bridge like something physical. Priya, the flight attendant, went white. Marcus Webb, who'd come to the door to see what the delay was, actually said, out loud, "Did she just..." and didn't finish the sentence because there was nowhere for it to go. Renata Castillo, still holding her sleeping daughter, pulled the child fractionally closer, an instinct rather than a decision. Daniel did not look up at Karen. Not yet. He kept his hand on the old nun's wrist, his thumb finding her pulse, counting it the way he'd once counted his own daughters at 3 in the morning during a fever that frightened him more than any case he'd ever heard. "You're going to be all right," he told Sister Agnes quietly, only for her. "I've got you." But something in his shoulders had changed, a particular kind of stillness, the stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to need. The gate agent, a young man named Theo whose name tag read trainee, was already on his radio calling for medical assistance and for a supervisor, his voice cracking slightly on the second syllable of priority. The boarding line behind Karen had gone utterly silent. 40 people watching a woman in Kashmir explain, unprompted, that an elderly religious sister's injury was a scheduling inconvenience. "This is exactly the kind of thing that delays everyone," Karen continued, to the gate agent, to the cabin, to whoever would still listen. "I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm just saying, there's a reason there are standards for who should be allowed to hold up a boarding process. Some people simply shouldn't fly if they can't keep pace. It was the third sentence, not the shove, which might have been waved away as an accident by anyone less attentive than the man kneeling on that jet bridge. But the casual, practiced cruelty of some people simply shouldn't fly, delivered without a flicker of doubt, that made Daniel finally lift his head and look at her directly. He did not raise his voice. That was, perhaps, the most unsettling thing about him in that moment, that a man capable of such fury chose, instead, absolute quiet. "Ma'am," he said, still kneeling, still holding the old woman's wrist. "I need you to step back from the stairwell and not move from this jet bridge until paramedics and the airport police have spoken with you." Karen's laugh was short, disbelieving, performative for the crowd she still imagined was on her side. "Excuse me? Who exactly do you think you are?" It was Theo, the trainee gate agent, who answered her, not Daniel. Theo had gone still over his radio, his eyes flicking from the screen of his handheld scanner, where Daniel's boarding credential had auto-populated with a security flag the carrier reserved for a very short list of federal dignitaries, up to the kneeling man's face and back down again, as though needing to confirm the match twice. "Ma'am," Theo said, his voice unsteady. "That's Justice Okafor Reyes, of the Supreme Court of the United States." The jet bridge did not gasp so much as exhale, a long collective breath that had apparently been held since the moment Karen's shoulder met an old woman's bag strap. Marcus Webb actually took a half-step backward, as though proximity itself had become dangerous. Renata Castillo's mouth opened slightly and stayed that way. Karen's face went through every stage of a building collapsing in real time. First confusion, a small furrow, a blink, the assumption that she had simply misheard. Then the beginning of processing, her eyes flicking to Daniel's coat, his hands, the leather satchel visible through the open cabin door, searching for some external confirmation her mind refused to supply on its own. Then the realization proper, arriving in her body before her composure could catch up. A visible drain of color from her cheeks, her hand rising halfway to her own collarbone in an unconscious, useless gesture of self-protection. Then the attempt to recover, her chin lifting, her mouth opening to say something. "I didn't mean," or "you can't possibly," or some fragment that never fully assembled itself into a sentence. And then, last, the understanding, total, irreversible, that nothing she said next would matter because the moment that mattered had already happened, and it had been recorded by no fewer than 6 phones now angled toward her from the boarding line. "I want to be very clear," Daniel said, rising slowly to his feet, brushing tarmac grit from his knee. His voice carrying the particular calm of a man who has spent a career not needing volume to be heard. "I am not speaking right now as a justice. I'm speaking as a man who watched you shove a 73-year-old woman down a flight of stairs and then call her injury and inconvenience to your schedule. That is the only credential that matters in this conversation." A man in an airport police windbreaker was already coming up the stairs 2 at a time, having been radioed in by ground operations the moment Theo's scanner flagged a federal protectee involved in an incident. Behind him, a second officer, and behind her, a paramedic crew already wheeling a gurney across the tarmac toward the base of the steps where Sister Agnes now sat, color returning slowly to her face, her hand still resting in the crook of a stranger's elbow. Priya, who had crouched beside her the moment Daniel stood. "Ma'am, I need you to come with us," the first officer said to Karen, his hand extending. Not toward handcuffs yet, but toward the simple, irreversible gesture of separation, of "step this way." "There's a witness allegation of an assault on an elderly passenger, and given the individual involved," his eyes flicked once, briefly, toward Daniel, an acknowledgement rather than a deference. "This is going to be handled federally, not by the airline." "This is absurd," Karen said, but her voice had lost its register entirely. What came out was thinner, higher, something closer to the voice underneath the voice she'd built her whole adult life around. "I barely touched her. She fell. People fall. I have a connection." "You won't be making that connection," the officer said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the flat finality of a man stating a schedule. The captain's voice came over the intercom a moment later, calm, measured, the practiced neutrality of a man who has delivered 1,000 routine announcements and was now delivering one that was anything but. "Folks, we're going to have a short ground delay while we resolve a situation at the door." I appreciate your patience. We'll have you in the air as soon as we're able." Nobody in the cabin moved to complain. Nobody even reached for their phone to check the time. They walked Karen back up the jet bridge rather than through the cabin. A small mercy extended not to her but to the passengers who didn't need to watch her pass twice. Though the boarding line she'd cut through on her way down now parted again on her way back up, and this time no one looked away. A woman near the gate, holding a toddler's hand, said nothing at all, only watched. Her face a held door that would not open for Karen's last attempt at an explanation. Theo, the trainee, stood very straight at his podium and did not meet her eyes once. Daniel knelt back down beside Sister Agnes as the paramedics arrived, his hand briefly on her shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," he told her. "Not one thing." "I know," she said, and her voice, though still shaken, had steadied into something wry. "I have been pushed around by worse than her justice, usually by men with budgets." She managed a real smile this time, and around them, several people who had been holding their breath let out something that was almost a laugh, the release valve of a crowd that has just watched cruelty answered, finally, by something other than silence. The applause started small, Renata first, one hand against the back of her sleeping daughter, the other clapping softly, almost involuntarily, and then Marcus, and then it moved backward through the cabin in a wave nobody had orchestrated. The particular sound of 40 strangers agreeing, without discussion, that something correct had just occurred. Sister Agnes, lifted gently onto the gurney for a precautionary hospital check, raised one hand in something between a blessing and a wave, and the cabin's applause softened into something gentler, almost reverent, as the paramedics wheeled her away. Daniel returned to seat 2C 20 minutes later, once the captain confirmed the flight would proceed without further delay. Sister Agnes cleared by paramedics with nothing worse than a deep bruise and a request that she let someone else carry her bag for the rest of the trip. He sat, finally let his shoulders drop, and looked once out the oval window at the gray morning brightening slowly over the runway. Priya brought him a fresh coffee without being asked and set it down with a small, unspoken nod that said more than any sentence could have. He took out his phone and texted his daughter. "Proud of you yesterday. Prouder of you every day before that, too." Then he closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to let the morning settle, and somewhere behind him the cabin doors closed for the second and final time. Karen Voss Whitfield was charged later that day with simple assault and interference with airport operations, with federal prosecutors signaling additional charges under review given the protectee status, though Justice Okafor Reyes would later ask, through a brief statement from his clerk's office, that any prosecution proceed exactly as it would have for any other passenger. No more, no less. The airline issued a statement within hours confirming a lifetime ban from its carrier and an internal review of gate-level de-escalation training. Sister Agnes flew to Bethesda 2 days later, on a different flight, in an aisle seat someone had quietly upgraded without telling her who. Somewhere over North Carolina that morning, the cabin lights dimmed for the in-flight service, and the only sound was the steady, ordinary hum of an aircraft doing exactly what it was built to do, carrying people gently the rest of the way home.